Hey guys, so this is probably what you guys have been waiting for, and that this is going to be our first chapter exploring mental health diagnoses. And our first focal point is going to be the anxiety, trauma, and stressor-related disorders. So before we get into our disorders, and this is something that you guys will become familiar with in coming lectures, is I always like to kind of start these off by discussing what it is like the focal point, I guess, of this particular category. So in this instance, we're going to talk a little bit more about stress and anxiety before getting into these disorders. So what is stress? Stress, broadly speaking, can be thought of as any disruption of homeostasis. Homeostasis being the body's status quo or kind of baseline state of being. And for humans, because we have the unique ability to anticipate the future, this means that frequently our homeostasis is disrupted on the basis of us anticipating it being disrupted, meaning that you aren't just stressed out in the moment when you graduate and you're out in the world and you're looking for a job, but you begin to stress years maybe ahead of graduation, just thinking about getting your first job and kind of being out there on your own. Stressors can be physical and psychosocial in nature. Physical stressors would be things that physically impact us, like being hurt, being involved in violence, starvation, drought, things like that. Psychosocial stressors would include things like significant life events like graduation, marriage, divorce, kids, moving. Psychosocial events can also relate to work, as well as cultural or other types of stressors as well, things like poverty or discrimination. Daily hassles can also be a form of psychosocial stress, things like oversleeping or getting stuck in traffic, things of that nature. But the unique piece is, even though stressors themselves can really vary, at the end of the day, all stressors trigger the same response physically. So regardless of what's stressing you out, whether it is racial discrimination or a traffic jam, or that you broke your leg, or that you're dealing with food insecurity, all of that stuff is going to trigger the same physical response, which you guys can see reflected under the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system on the right-hand side of the screen. So some of the things that happen are that blood will rush to your heart and your muscles, your pupils will dilate. Basically, you're kind of getting ready to fight. And this is because this particular reaction evolved to help us adapt with more physical types of stressors that would require kind of like a fight or flight type of response. And while this is the same thing that happens to us physically when we are psychosocially stressed, emotions can vary stressor to stressor. And one such emotion that we might experience when stressed is anxiety. Anxiety in and of itself is a future-oriented type of worry that typically has a negative valence to it, meaning that you are worried about something going badly in the future. Excitement would be the more kind of positively oriented version of this particular emotion. So examples of anxieties are things like, what if I mess up this speech? What if she doesn't like me, or he doesn't like me, or they don't like me? So again, very future-oriented, but also negatively oriented as well. Generally, new situations are going to be things that prompt anxiety more so for people, because anxiety in and of itself is this kind of survival type of mechanism that is aimed at alerting us to new things or things that could potentially be threatening. And even though a new thing may not be threatening, we won't really know that until we really encounter that thing and explore for ourselves whether or not it is going to be threatening. So that's one of the reasons that we're more likely to feel anxious when we move or begin a new job or graduate from college or meet somebody new, because we don't yet kind of know the lay of the land. Normal anxiety is time limited. So typically something new will be presented, you'll be a little bit anxious, you'll realize things are fine, and that anxiety will go away. Or you may be anxious in legitimate types of situations, like if you ran out of gas on the side of the road in the middle of a snowstorm. That is a legitimately stressful situation in which your livelihood could really be threatened. And so that all kind of is encompassed under what we would consider to be normal anxiety. Abnormal anxiety is anxiety that spirals out of proportion to reality. So when people are freaking out about things that aren't legitimately threatening or things that aren't new, typically this is when we consider a person to have an anxiety-based disorder. At this point, I would recommend pausing our lecture in order to view a woman named Miriam in the snake phobia behavioral exposure therapy video. This is a really nice example of a woman with a snake phobia. And this also kind of walks you through her symptoms, and it also shows you a treatment approach for not just snake phobias, but as you guys will see on the next slide, this is a treatment approach that really works across the board for a variety of anxiety-based disorders. So I'd recommend pausing, checking that out, and then coming back. The last thing I'll point out on the slide before moving on is that the graphic on the right-hand side of the screen is going to show you some differences between everyday anxiety versus abnormal anxiety, just so you can kind of get a flavor for what is within the bounds of normality versus what might be diagnostic. So for example, having a case of nerves or sweating before a big test, business presentation, stage performance, or other significant event is considered to be pretty everyday, pretty normal. But to have out of the blue panic attacks and to be preoccupied with the fear of having another panic attack and not being able to get on with your test or presentation or other big event would be considered more of an abnormal presentation. So how do anxiety disorders develop? The behavioral theory is a really great theory for anxiety. Because you guys are coming to this class from a variety of different backgrounds and aren't necessarily thinking about therapy, I don't really talk about theory a whole lot in this class, nor do I talk a ton about treatment, just because that's kind of beyond the scope of what most of you guys really need. But I am going to talk about therapy or theory and therapy within this particular lecture, just because the anxiety disorders map on so nicely to behavioral theory that it's really going to help you guys understand where these things come from and how to treat them if you understand this theory and complementary therapy. So how does an anxiety disorder develop? Initially, the individual learns that a feared stimulus is reliably associated with fight or flight symptoms. So in Miriam's case, she has learned over the course of her life that snakes are always associated with her heart racing and feeling shaky and crying and just feeling really, really scared. The person also learns that when they experience those fight or flight symptoms, that they also associate those symptoms with a high likelihood of a catastrophic belief coming true. So in Miriam's case, she's worried that when she begins to really feel her heart and she starts shaking and panicking, she's really afraid that the snake's going to get loose in the room and that she somehow is going to become trapped and have a heart attack and no one's going to be able to get to her and she's going to die. So pretty catastrophic, but pretty typical, I would say, of people who have what I like to call anxiety brain. The individual also learns that if they simply avoid the fear stimulus, they can also avoid the fight or flight symptoms and avoid any likelihood of their belief coming true. So if Miriam just avoids snakes, she doesn't have to deal with her heart. She doesn't have to deal with any likelihood of her catastrophic belief coming true. And so treatment basically entails new learning, teaching a person that that system of beliefs that they have isn't necessarily true. So breaking apart those learned associations. So teaching the person that the feared stimulus isn't necessarily associated with the fight or flight symptoms, which aren't necessarily associated with the catastrophic belief. And the way to do this is through exposure, basically having the person face their fear to again learn that what they expect to happen is not likely to happen. So Miriam was in the room with the snake and basically learned that she could be around the snake and that over time she stopped shaking, she stopped crying, her heart rate returned to normal, so she could be in the room with the snake without having those symptoms. She also learned that even when she had those symptoms that she didn't die, her worst fear did not come true. And the therapist kind of identified this for her by jokingly kind of saying like, so did you die? And, you know, she could kind of laugh and say like, no, I didn't die. Like it felt bad, but it wasn't dangerous. And no, I didn't die. And so this theory may be applied across anxiety disorders. So this is something we're going to be talking about in this chapter and in chapter 5, which goes over obsessive compulsive disorders, which are very closely related to anxiety disorders. We, broadly speaking, refer to this type of therapy as exposure therapy because we're basically exposing people to the things that they're afraid of. And there's a tremendously strong evidence base for this particular approach. Okay, so let's get into the types of things that we might be diagnosing a person with. First up, we've got panic attacks. So one thing to note with panic attacks is that these things are not diagnostic in and of themselves. Rather, they're kind of like a building block, a thing that we define that then plays a role in other diagnoses. So you're going to need to know what a panic attack is, but just remember that you wouldn't diagnose a person with just a panic attack. You'd be diagnosing them with something else. So what is a panic attack? A panic attack is an abrupt surge of intense fear or discomfort that's evidenced by 4 or more symptoms on the right-hand side of the screen. And just looking at these symptoms, you're going to see that many of them relate back to those indicators of sympathetic nervous system activation that we saw on the previous slide. So pounding heart, sweating, trembling, shortness of breath, feelings of choking, chest pain, nausea or abdominal distress, dizziness, chills or heat sensations, paresthesia or numbness, derealization or depersonalization, which is basically the feeling that you're either kind of losing touch with reality or losing touch with yourself, or a fear of going crazy or dying are going to be the symptoms that we're looking for. And again, we need 4 or more of those for diagnosis. A panic attack is going to peak within minutes, so it comes on really, really fast. And the duration itself kind of varies, but the average is about 30 minutes. Panic attacks in and of themselves are completely normal and impact about 1/3 of adults by themselves. So again, these aren't diagnostic. These are actually considered to be normal, but they may become abnormal in particular contexts. So normal panic attacks are sometimes referred to as just kind of regular panic attacks. They may be associated with any old disorder. In this case, we would refer to that panic attack as an expected panic attack and may specify the person's diagnosis by adding with panic attacks at the end of their diagnosis. So for instance, if we had a person who had panic attacks exclusively in public speaking situations, we would refer to that as an expected panic attack, and the diagnosis we would likely give would be something like social anxiety disorder, if they met criteria for social anxiety disorder with panic attacks. So that's one way in which panic attacks become diagnostic, is they are reliably expected in the context of particular disorder. But again, for a good chunk of people, they just kind of occur randomly. They're not really problematic, and they just kind of are. But again, for some people, they end up becoming expected and they're associated with a disorder. Another way in which panic attacks may become diagnostic is if they become persistent and are unexpected in nature. We will sometimes call these recurrent unexpected panic attacks. Interestingly enough, they can occur in either a calm or an anxious state. A lot of people don't really think of people having panic attacks when they're calm, but that can happen. I've worked with a person who had nocturnal panic attacks, meaning that she had attacks more so as she was falling asleep, and sometimes she even kind of woke herself up in a panic. One of the things that makes these panic attacks abnormal is that they're unexpected. So it's more typical to see an expected attack where it's like there's a particular situation that makes you anxious and you have a panic attack. So what makes these different and abnormal again is the fact that they're unexpected. There's no real kind of indicator as to what's happening for this person. And so we'll sometimes refer to these as false alarms because they aren't really alerting the person to anything in particular, and they're just kind of random. On the right-hand side of the screen, you guys can see a diagram depicting the panic loop, which is basically this loop that people will kind of work their way through, starting with the bodily sensations, the physical symptoms of a panic attack, leading to the full-blown attack. The person then feels high anxiety about the attack. They develop fear of panic, and it's actually this fear of panic that makes it more likely that they're going to experience more symptoms and be sensitive to those symptoms in the future. To kind of highlight this loop, I always tell a story of my first panic attack. I've only had one. It was when I was visiting a friend of mine in Wilmington, and she was getting ready to move back to the mountains. And so she wanted to do all of the typical kind of touristy things, including going on the Battleship North Carolina, which I'm a pretty easygoing person. So I was just like, yeah, sure, whatever it is you want to do. I just want to visit and have fun. I've never been on one of those before. I'm slightly claustrophobic. I not severely, I just like to have an air hole, and I like to be able to see that air hole, which doesn't really strike me as strange. Air is important and I like to have it, and I like to be able to see that I have it. So for those of you that haven't been on the Battleship North Carolina, you kind of go beneath the deck, and there's these series of arrows that you have to follow. So it's very strange. It's disorienting. If you want to like bail on the tour, it's not like a museum tour where you can just kind of like hop over, the velvet ropes, or like turn around and go back. There's not really a way to bail in the middle. If you feel uncomfortable, you just have to keep going. It's also the middle of summer, so it's extremely hot. And partway through, I just can start to really feel my heart, and I'm starting to get really hot and sweaty, and my head's kind of pounding. I'm like, okay, like I'm starting to panic a little bit. Like I'd really like to have some fresh air, to feel a breeze. I'd really like to be outside now. But she looks like she's having fun. So I just kind of ignore it. And I'm like, you know what, this will be over. Give it another hour. It's fine. And so I pretend to like read some of the different things that we see describing, the kitchens and the living quarters and whatever. And then we finally finish and we get out into the daylight, and I immediately like double over and exhale and take in a huge breath. And I look over, and she's doing the same thing. Apparently, we were both panicking for like an hour, but thought that the other person was having a really good time. We're both therapists too. So we decided to just kind of put our own selves aside, hang in there for the other person, which is very typical for us. But we both kind of had a laugh. But at the end of the day, what contributed to me being able to hang in there, and what contributed to my panic attack not turning into a repeated scenario, is because I could acknowledge that this was just a panic attack, wasn't a heart attack. There wasn't any chance of this being fatal. There wasn't any chance of this hurting me. And I could just kind of accept it and deal with the fact that it was uncomfortable, and move on. And the opposite of that is basically what drives both panic disorder and recurrent expected attacks, like the one I described for you in the previous slide, is because people don't know what's going on. They freak out, they become afraid of that situation, and then that fear is what drives future attacks. And so that is kind of another diagnostic feature of panic disorder, is that we've got these recurrent unexpected attacks, but we've also got worry about additional attacks or some type of avoidance. The prevalence of panic disorder is about 5% in adults. Agoraphobia is a closely related disorder to panic disorder. It entails a person who's anxious about 2 or more specific situations, specifically public transportation, open spaces and closed spaces, crowds, and leaving home alone. So we've got 5 options, and the person needs to be anxious about 2 or more. Beyond that, the person needs to either fear or avoid those situations because escape may be difficult, or help is unavailable if symptoms of panic or embarrassing types of symptoms emerge. So the person's basically afraid that they're going to go out, be in like a crowded market or something like that, and that they're either going to start to have a panic attack, which is scary because they don't understand what's happening and they're not going to be able to get away, or alternatively the person's afraid that like I've heard of people having like anaphylactic kind of versions of this, where they're afraid they're going to have an allergic reaction. Or I've heard versions of this where the person's afraid they're going to like fall or just make an idiot out of themselves. And so they basically avoid and won't kind of go into those situations without some type of support, or some people won't go into those situations at all. So this anxiety is extremely out of proportion with respect to the actual amount of danger in the scenario. So you can see how this would complement a panic disorder, because if we had someone with panic disorder who was having these random panic attacks that they didn't understand, it could definitely lead to a person starting to just kind of not go out anymore and really limiting what it is they were doing. The prevalence of this is about 1 to 2% of adults. Social anxiety disorder, sometimes referred to as SAD or social phobia, is a fear or anxiety about one or more situations involving the scrutiny of others, including things like social interactions, being observed, or performing in front of others. These are not specific things, so it's not like on the previous slide where it had to be 2 of those 5 specifically. Here it's a bit more general or a bit more vague, just one or more situations involving the scrutiny of others, where a person would be open to judgment or criticism. In kids, we're looking for this in a peer setting too, not just with adults. So if kids are a little bit quiet or reserved around adults, we want to make sure that that behavior is extending to their peers as well. The fear ultimately stems back to being negatively evaluated. So the person doesn't want to be criticized or judged. The person becomes fearful or anxious in these social situations. And in kids, we may see things like crying, tantruming, freezing, or clinging. This is diagnosed in about 3 to 5% of children, 12 to 13% of adults, so extremely common, the third most commonly diagnosed disorder in the US. Most people develop social phobia in their teenage years, and this makes sense. Your teens are kind of when you start to pay attention more to social hierarchies and other people's opinions may start to mean more to you. It's also possible that a person with social anxiety might not actually be socially anxious. They might just be anxious in performance-based scenarios. Because if you really look at the criteria, it's just kind of focusing in on the scrutiny of others, not necessarily the scrutiny of others for social reasons. And so sometimes you might have someone with social phobia who is legitimately afraid of socializing and conversing with others and being criticized in that scenario. But sometimes you have people with test anxiety or fear of public speaking, but they're totally fine in other situations. And so sometimes we'll refer to that as performance only, meaning that the person's fine in social scenarios, but they become anxious in situations where they're kind of center stage and they're made to perform. And that is really what's making them anxious. The idea of being potentially judged in those performance-based situations. And if a person has a performance-only type of social phobia, that person seems to have a better prognosis, meaning they have a greater likelihood of recovery and quick recovery at that. So on the surface, social phobia may look a lot like agoraphobia, but the reason is different. Again, with agoraphobia, it's a fear of help not being available or having symptoms that are scary for one reason or another. With social phobia, though, it's really that fear of negative evaluation. And again, despite the name, a person could have social phobia that is actually quite socially competent and really just becomes anxious in performance type situations. Specific phobias, very similar to social phobias. Here, though, we are experiencing fear or anxiety about a specific scenario, unsurprisingly. Specifically, we may see animal-based phobias, natural environment types of phobias, so things like storms. We may see blood injection injury phobias, like fears of getting a shot or going to the dentist. Situational phobias, which would be any type of situation that is not natural or environmental in nature, like flying or being in an elevator. We also have other phobias, which would be like clowns or anything that doesn't fall into those other 4 categories. This impacts about 4% of kids and about 13% of adults, so very similar to the social phobia. Again, kids typically express anxiety as crying, tantruming, freezing, or clinging. Versus outright fear and avoidance, simply because kids don't really have the autonomy to avoid scenarios. So they're forced to endure them, but then will tantrum and cling. People are more likely to have more than one specific phobia versus just one. And typically the response that we're going to see is that sympathetic nervous system, those symptoms of panic, even if it's not a full-fledged panic attack. We may also see expected panic attacks in this particular scenario, just like we might see an expected panic attack associated with a social phobia. One unique piece, though, is that the blood injection injury phobias are more likely to be associated with a physiological process referred to as vasovagal syncope, which is actually a lowered heart rate, a lower blood pressure, and fainting. So the body is really kind of doing the opposite. It's actually a parasympathetic activation versus a sympathetic nervous system activation. So why might this be different from other anxiety disorders? At the end of the day, it all goes back to survival, that the reason our anxiety reaction is what it is to help us survive. And in most scenarios, if we freak out and we're scared, the fight or flight makes sense to either fight off whatever it is, run away, or in some cases freeze. Sometimes it's referred to as the fight, flight, or freeze. But the blood injection injury is a little bit different because it has to do more so with injury that's already happened versus anticipatory injury. And so if you are actually injured and bleeding, to raise your heart rate, to raise your blood pressure and run away could actually just contribute to you bleeding out faster and dying faster. And so it makes more sense in that scenario to lower your heart rate, lower your blood pressure, and to faint, conserve your resources. And so again, the reason for this is survival. It's just that the context of the BII phobia is a little bit different than the context of the rest. Another interesting piece about many common phobias is that most of them have an evolutionary basis. So this slide is depicting the top phobias in the United States. Up top, unsurprisingly, we have insects, snakes, birds, and other animals. Next, we have heights, which include mountains, tall buildings, and bridges. Then we have enclosed spaces like caves, tunnels, elevators. We have flying, and then being in or on water. So I've drawn red circles to highlight the various pieces of these descriptions that relate back to ancestral times, things that would have scared and impacted our ancestors, things like animals, heights, caves, water, storms. And so you'll see here that, again, many of the things that impact us today are things that would have impacted one of our ancestors. And the reason for that is that, evolutionarily speaking, we are more adapted to the environments of our ancestors than we are the environments we live in today. And that simply is because evolution is very, very slow. And so today you have more people being afraid of animals and heights and water and enclosed spaces than you do highways or planes or cars or guns or viruses or McDonald's, Western diets, things that, actually do kill more people today than snakes do. So there's an interesting kind of evolutionary piece to many phobias. One recurring theme that you will see pop up again and again this semester is exercise as a treatment modality for various disorders. One of the reasons I started focusing in on exercise is because I got a question from a student several years ago about how my class didn't really teach them how to treat anything, which is because, treatment's a whole nother class. It's a whole nother several classes. It's also a graduate class versus an undergraduate one. But I did kind of appreciate the person's question and that they want to know more, like, so what do we do, after we diagnose? And because a good number of students in this class come to this class from more kind of medical-esque kind of backgrounds, like nursing, exercise science, pre-med, pre-PT, pre-OT, pre-PA, pre-everything. I decided to focus in on exercise more in this class and to kind of share that information so that you would walk away not just knowing what's going on diagnostically, but a good number of exercise prescriptions for these different diagnoses that you could use professionally, or that you could even kind of file in the back of your head to use later, if you happen to be having a tough time with one of these diagnoses. So exercise will be a recurring theme. So as far as anxiety disorders go, clinical trials show that exercise is as effective as certain medications for treating anxiety, which collectively impacts about 20% of the population. Exercise is effective because it teaches a different outcome, just like exposure therapy. And what I mean here is that when you're exercising, you'll recall that I mentioned earlier that when we're stressed, all stress, no matter what it is, activates the same physical response. And what is exercise if not a predictable, controlled version of stress? And so when we exercise, we're activating the same physiological mechanisms as when we're anxious. Our heart rate goes up, we sweat, we get hot, but we're not scared because we understand that it's exercise and that this is controllable and that this is expected. And so sometimes I'll have clients of mine exercise and really kind of pay attention to the fact that this feels super similar to anxiety, and that the only reason you're not afraid is because it's exercise and it's expected, and you could choose to approach anxiety the same way. You could choose to approach a panic attack and just kind of remind yourself like, oh, like this is just like exercise. It's fine. It's uncomfortable. It's going to go away. I just have to relax. And so exercise teaches a different outcome, just like exposure therapy does. It also increases serotonin, norepinephrine, and brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which are all chemicals that promote well-being. Specifically, BDNF is this kind of, I describe it as like a memory juice that when it is released into the brain, it helps the brain secrete, not secrete, it helps the brain cement new memories. And so not only are you learning something new about the outcome and about the symptoms and how similar it is to anxiety, but you're also dousing your brain in this chemical that's going to help you remember that. Exercise also helps to reduce muscle tension, and it gets you up and moving, which is the opposite of what anxiety and depression are telling you to do. As far as the prescription goes, I would recommend 20 minutes of low intensity aerobic exercise 3 times a week for people who are more sensitive to anxiety, not even necessarily people with a diagnosis. At the end of the day, this seems to help people not misinterpret their anxiety symptoms quite as much. And if you increase the intensity, research has shown that has led to faster results with a greater decreased fear of particular symptoms. Okay. So moving on to our trauma and stressor-related disorders. First up, we have post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. PTSD is a two-pronged diagnosis, so we basically need the person to be exposed to trauma and then have a post-traumatic stress type response. So we define trauma as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of these ways. Through direct experience, so you were actually raped, you were actually in a car accident that seriously injured you, you were actually threatened at gunpoint, or witnessing, so you basically saw one of those things happen to somebody else. You learned about it in a close other, so this could mean you learned that your partner or your mom or your sister or brother, dad, friend, someone that you're close to, that you love, went through an experience like this. So you learned that your mom was raped, or you learned that your dad was held up at gunpoint and like robbed while downtown, or you learn that your partner in kind of serving their country overseas almost sustained some serious type of injury through an explosion or something like that. The key here though is that really love, like you really have to love the person to be so impacted by simply hearing a story. So there's no witnessing to this piece. And the fourth way is through repeated experience. This most typically impacts either people in the military or first responders. So like a firefighter, for instance, who day after day after day is rescuing people from fires and just seeing terrible things, or an EMT kind of having a similar type of experience. And it's not necessarily that there was one really bad fire or one really bad roadside accident. It's that this person does this for a living every day. And so it just kind of adds up. So we need one of those things. In addition, we need this kind of follow-up piece, because lots of people are traumatized. You're going to see in one of the subsequent slides that some estimate that over the course of a lifetime, up to 90% of people experience trauma. So trauma actually is a pretty common thing, but not everybody has PTSD. So that's really where this kind of stress response comes into play. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty in this particular class, but in a nutshell, you guys just need to know that we're looking for symptoms across 4 categories: intrusive, negative cognition or mood, avoidance, and reactivity. So symptoms of intrusion basically mean that the trauma is intruding into the person's regular life. So They're trying to sleep, but they're having nightmares, or they're trying to live their life, but they're having flashbacks and recurrent memories, or they're walking by a garage where they were assaulted and suddenly memories come flying back and they're having distress that's cued by this place. So that's what intrusion is. And again, I like to think of intrusion as the memory intruding upon the person's life when it's in an unwanted manner. Negative impact on cognition or mood means that cognition or mood is being negatively impacted, basically. So this could mean poor memory. So the person doesn't remember what happened, or a spotty memory, or worsening memory for what happened. The person could start to develop catastrophic beliefs. So if we have a sexual assault survivor, that person may start to swear off men and believe that all men are evil and bad, which is a very catastrophic kind of takeaway from a singular event that involved one person. There are other types of indicators that we could see here, but those are just kind of two examples. Negative mood changes would include things like being more persistently sad, losing interest in things that the person enjoyed, which we sometimes refer to as anhedonia, being detached from others, things of that nature. Avoidance, simply put, can be either internal or external. So the person can begin to avoid external things like taking a different route to work to avoid again, like a parking garage where the person was attacked, or taking a different way to work so that you're parking next to a blue light kind of call center and you can walk past that on your way into work, or trying to avoid a particular bar, or to avoid running into a particular person. You get the idea. We're avoiding something physical and external. Internal avoidance is trying to avoid an emotion, a thought, a memory, something like that. It can be harder sometimes to detect internal avoidance, but sometimes you might see people who like drink or use drugs as a way to kind of forget and, get high and forget temporarily about what's happened. And then finally, we're going to be looking for indicators of reactivity. So this can include things like a person just becoming more irritable or self-destructive through drug use or sex or spending or whatever. We could also see a person become more hypervigilant and kind of jumpy or easily startled. In children, some things to look out for are that kids in general, and this will be a theme that we'll discuss more next chapter, but kids don't really understand the links sometimes between what's happened to them and how they feel. So kids not going to be able to tell you that, like, I saw dad hit mom and, now I'm sad and scared. They're not going to be able to kind of spell things out in that way. And so we're not going to get this kind of concrete story from kids. So instead, what we have to look for are warning signs, which include things like more violent play themes. So instead of playing house in the fairly typical manner where maybe you have like, parents and kids, and everybody loves each other, that now we're kind of seeing more violence maybe among those characters. Kids may have unrecognizable nightmares. Sometimes there might be a theme, but it might just be that kids are waking up scared and crying and they can't quite remember what it was they were dreaming about. We may see social withdrawal or clinging behaviors where kids are just kind of pulling away from friends or loved ones. Alternatively, they may be clinging specifically to people that they still trust or feel close to. We may also see developmental backslide, where a kid may have been able to do something developmentally before, but now they can't. So they were potty trained, but now they're wetting the bed, or they were sleeping with the lights off, but now they need a nightlight, or they'd stopped sucking their thumb, but now they are. Again, you get the picture. This could potentially be indicative of or related to something called reactive attachment disorder, which is something that happens in really little kids who are younger than 5, who basically develop persistent inhibition and emotional withdrawal. And this is associated with really persistent, either neglectful or unstable caregiving. So this could be growing up in the same house with parents who are just never there, or outright abusive or neglectful, or this could be bouncing around a foster care system where maybe you've had great foster care parents, but you're somewhere new every month or every few months. And so so it's very unstable. Very rare, really only impacts about 10% of kids who are in neglectful or unstable environments. So even in that awful environment, it's not impacting everyone. So again, very rare, but just kind of throwing that out there as another kind of potential diagnosis. Another kind of perspective to take on childhood experiences is to assess either a child, or this is a scale you can use for adults as well to kind of go over that person's childhood, is to use this adverse childhood experiences scale. Sometimes it's referred to as ACEs. And if you look online, you can pull up so many different kind of questionnaires that relate to this. But in a nutshell, there are 5 different ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, that relate to the areas of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. At the end of the day, having higher scores, meaning that a person has encountered more of these than not, means that this person's more likely to have physical health problems like heart disease and diabetes, more likely to have mental health problems like depression or substance use, more likely to have poor academic achievement, more likely to have early death. There might even be a possible epigenetic impact on offspring that you guys can read a little bit more about in one of the articles that I've linked you guys to for this unit. Having 4 or more ACEs is generally considered to be high risk. So again, in general, in this class, I'm not really going to be throwing a ton of stuff at you treatment-wise, but this is a really helpful perspective to have that I think can apply to a number of you. So this is good to know as a teacher. This is good to know as just a healthcare worker. And it can be helpful to have on hand or on staff a questionnaire that addresses these things, just to, even with adults, kind of ascertain what their childhood was like, and to kind of figure that out relatively quickly and with a nice clean number, and use that number as a way to predict, you know, okay, what's the likelihood that this person can have a tough time in school, or what's the likelihood that this is maybe going to contribute to some physical health problems later on in life. So abuse-wise, we're looking for either physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. Those are 3 different categories. Neglect can either be physical or emotional in nature. And then household dysfunction would be mental illness within the house, having a relative who is incarcerated, a close relative, having any type of abuse directed towards a parent, there being substance abuse in the house, or divorce within the house. And again, 4 or more is considered to be high risk. Some extra pieces about PTSD. Males are at a higher risk for trauma, the most common trauma being possible exposure to tragic death. So typically we'll get this in the form of like first responders, or people serving in the military who were threatened with death or experienced serious injury. Females, though, have a greater likelihood of developing PTSD, and this is most commonly associated with sexual assault. So that's kind of an interesting takeaway piece there, is that men are traumatized more, but women, when traumatized, it most likely is going to be sexual assault, and that tends to really kind of relate then to that person developing PTSD. But again, most people with trauma don't develop PTSD. The prevalence is about 11% of adults. And as you'll see below here, and as I'll talk about here in a minute, a much larger number of people has been traumatized. Some things to take into consideration as far as mass traumas go, which would be traumas that impact a large number of people all at once, are that proximity plays a really important role in determining a person's risk for developing PTSD. So when you've got something really big, like 9/11, for instance, it matters where a person is when that trauma happens. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a map of Manhattan. And research shows that people who were in the orange area south of Canal Street when the planes hit and the towers came down, those people had a 20% likelihood of developing PTSD. People in the yellow area between Canal and 110th Street only had about 7% likelihood of developing PTSD. So there's a pretty big difference there. And again, the only difference is really proximity. So if you end up working in kind of first responder, or you're kind of volunteering with the Red Cross to go and help with some of these situations, that can be an important thing to keep in mind, is to assess kind of where people were when a mass trauma occurred. Similarly, electronic media exposure is also contributing to something called conceptual bracket creep, which is a really jargony phrase, which basically just means that our previous understanding of PTSD is being challenged by the notion that today we could all sit down and willingly traumatize ourselves with the endless stream of stuff that we can see on the internet. Previously, it was thought that exposure to trauma had to happen in person, directly, or through witnessing or learning about it in a close loved one, or through repeated exposure. But this electronic form is kind of challenging that definition. Currently, you do still need one of those 4 exposures that I talked about earlier, but who knows if that'll change in the future. And some researchers estimate that if we were to include electronic means of exposure, that approximately 90% of adults could potentially qualify for trauma, though not necessarily PTSD. As far as treatment goes, exposure therapy is a good approach for PTSD, much as it is for the other anxiety disorders we've approached or discussed. The only difference here is that we don't want to expose the person to the actual event again, because one difference between PTSD and the other anxiety disorders is that here we're dealing with an actual survival threat. So we don't want to put that person back in the scenario. But what's abnormal about PTSD is that the person continues to react as if the situation is happening again, even though it's not. So you've got a person who, let's say, has survived sexual assault. The assault is over, but they're having intrusive memories and nightmares, and they're waking up screaming, sweating, crying as if the assault is happening again when it's not. So that's what's really abnormal, is not reacting to the trauma, but reacting to the trauma once the trauma is over. And so what we want to expose the person to isn't the trauma itself, because again, that was life-threatening. That was a normal anxiety situation. What we want to instead expose the person to is the memory. And so we can do this through imagination, having the person write about what happened or close their eyes and imagine it again and again to kind of desensitize to those memories. We can also use virtual reality, although these programs seem to thus far be designed primarily for military types of scenarios. And I have a video included in your class materials that'll kind of show you what virtual reality for PTSD looks like. So the last thing I want to talk about is exercise and stress. So nerve cells, much like muscle cells, are strengthened by breakdown and rest. So in the same way, if you want your muscle cells to be stronger, you work out, which causes breakdown and then repair and growth at night. If you want your brain to be stronger and more resilient to stress, what you have to do is kind of exercise it, so to speak. But the way that you would do this would be to expose your brain periodically to a milder, more controlled version of stress. And just so happens that exercise is a really great form of not just controllable stress, but predictable, mild stress. And so by exercising regularly, you're exposing your brain to that stress response and helping it to desensitize, which isn't going to prevent trauma, but that could potentially prevent the development of PTSD from trauma. And again, the reasons have to do with increased neural resistance, creating a stronger mind that's more capable of handling future challenges, and also just promoting a sense of mastery and self-confidence. The prescription here is physical exercise only once a week for anyone who is prone to the negative emotional consequences of stress. So if you're someone who just gets really worked up about stress, working out once a week could help you become more emotionally resilient. So you'll see that this is a really low dose, and that's going to be a theme that you're going to see this semester, is that working out for mental health is much less and less taxing than working out for physical health. All right, so that is all that I have for you guys. Talk to you next time.